All right, go ahead.
Okay, well, thanks for having me come out. I know it's late in the day, and if you're like me, it's been a very long day, so I appreciate your time and patience. I look forward to your questions at the end. Normally, I would say this was a class of mine. Feel free to ask questions as we go along, but since there's built-in Q&A, hopefully, unless something's really puzzling you, let's hold those to the end of the talk. Okay. Some themes of my talk, at least what I hope to leave you with, is I think economic freedom, even if it's not something you value, is something important to measure. Because we should know if there's trade-offs between economic freedom and other things you might value. It's not easy, as you can imagine. Like if I sat you down and gave you a yellow legal pad and said, what is economic freedom? How do we measure it? What sort of data is out there? But I think we do a fairly good job of measuring it for a large number of countries. And the nice thing about this is whatever somebody's values are, they can take our index and you think it might be positively related to some good stuff, you might think it'd be positively related to some bad stuff. You can go out and test that. And there's been several hundred studies using our index, and I've done a review of all of that work, and in almost all cases, and I'll talk about some that it's not, it basically is a positive relationship, meaning more economic freedom, more good stuff, whether it be GDP or life expectancy or anything else you might think of, and very little bad stuff. So what's the motivation for the EFW? Well, I think with the motivation for the EFW, I'll talk about the index itself, but my motivation goes back to a class I had in high school in political philosophy. And in that class, it seemed all we did would like argue over fundamental values. And we didn't seem to get anywhere because even if we talked about the world, we talked in anecdote. And so if we're talking about what's the best way to organize our healthcare system, it would come down to the UK's single-payer system versus the US. And that always found it very unsatisfying, right? The world's a very large place. There's lots of different ways to do things. How do we get our hands on that? And then I started studying economics, and some people of an older vintage might have taken a textbook. This is from Paul Samuelson's textbook. It's the best-selling econ textbook of all time. This is from, I think, the 1975 edition, maybe 1970 edition. And what it is Samuelson's extrapolation of different projections of, so here in 1960, US growth is indexed to 100. The USSR's growth is indexed to 50. And the point of this graph is based on Samuelson's estimates. You know, he projected that the USSR was going to grow much faster than the US because their superior planning, where they were investing higher rates of investment, and that sometime mid-80s, depending on the projections, the USSR would surpass the US in terms of relative growth rates. My point with this is not that Samuelson was wrong, although he was. He was wrong because what did we have in 1989? But the Soviet Union economic system collapsed. But we just have those two data points, and his information that he used to put into this was actually very, very poor. But that was a widely held view at the time, which was that a more top-down planned economy would have higher growth rates. It was one of the prices we paid for more laissez-faire in the US. Now, at the same time, just as it's kind of unfair to look back, like anything looking back at a different time and the models at a different time and say they were wrong, it might be unfair to look at the role that economic institutions play by just looking at the Korean Peninsula. Sure, at the extremes, we might say that an authoritarian government that allows very little political, civic, and economic freedom is going to be very poor. I mean, I wouldn't put a lot of faith into that number. The World Bank, the CIA is the only organization I know that actually tries to estimate the GDP of North Korea, right? But that's the estimate they come up with. They do seem to have solved most of their famine problems. But again, there's a wide gradient in the world, and so this example tells us very little about the differences between France and Norway, for example. I think the third reason to maybe care about collecting data goes back to this argument point. The kind of intellectual architect of the economic freedom of the world indexes was Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, along with Paul, watching too much Fast and the Furious, I was going to say Paul Walker. Michael Walker of the Fraser Institute was at a conference in 1984 on George Orwell's 1984. And they were saying, was George Orwell right? And Milton Friedman got up and said, we're all just arguing with anecdotes. We don't know anything because we're not measuring stuff. We're not doing the hard work of measuring. And he said, I wrote this in 1962. Historical evidence speaks with a single voice in the relation between political freedom and a free market. I know of no example in time or place of a society that has been marked by a large measure of political freedom and that has not also used something comparable to a free market to organize the bulk of economic activity. So he said, I said this, but I mean, how accurate is that? What does it mean to be a large measure? How would we even know? Oh, just in my head, I'm going to pull that out. Maybe that's not the case. We need to get better measures, and at that time, good measures of political freedom had been developed by Freedom House, and he said we need to do the same for economic freedom. Michael Walker heard him, and that started the Economic Freedom of the World project, of which I'm involved. So before I get into how is it measured, let me set aside a few things. I think if you've taken any econ course, a macro course, one of the first things we do is we talk about gross domestic product, and we talk about the problems with gross domestic product, right? What are some of the problems if you're taking the econ course, right? It doesn't measure home production because it's market goods and services. That doesn't mean it doesn't have usefulness. Excuse me, there's issues with measuring economic freedom, but it seems to be a good. We should try to measure it even though we might have issues with measuring it. Excuse me. I think like the production of all goods, there might be trade-offs. We should at least recognize that there are very few free lunches in the world. And so maybe more economic freedom means we have less happiness, for example, or we're less healthy. I just published a paper, we were going to talk about this at lunch, published a paper showing that in states in the US that are more economically free, okay, have lower tax rates, lower regulations, people exercise less. Now that's consistent with economic theory because higher returns to labor market, you work more, but people exercise less, that means less healthy behavior. The key thing is, all we're trying to do with this is measure economic freedom. You might have your own views on it. Obviously we think certain things deserve higher values and certain things do low values. But if you are not a big fan of economic freedom, you should want us to measure economic freedom as best as possible, because if you think the relationship more economic freedom means more bad stuff, the better we do this, the more likely it's going to show it leads to bad stuff. So here's our cover of our last year's report. I don't like the cover of this year's report because they only did it on A4 paper. It's a little too long. What is economic freedom? I like to put myself in the shoes of a representative person. Think about the average person in any state or country in the world and say, does that person have personal choice in economic affairs? So do they have the ability to enter and compete in labor markets? Okay, I'll delve a little deeper into that. Do they have the freedom to trade both domestically and abroad with other individuals? right? Does government do its job of protecting them and their property and providing a stable and well-functioning legal system and monetary system? Okay, so in practice, what does this mean? Well, we take data on 159 different countries on 42 variables. So we've been doing this since the early 90s. We've been trying to measure economic freedom. Obviously, the data has become a lot better. We first doing this, there might have been 17, 18 variables you could go measure going back to 1970. Now we have a lot more, thanks to organizations like the World Bank and the Global Competitiveness Report. All of our data, with one exception, comes from, well, even that one kind of comes from other sources, comes from IMF, World Bank. We're very open. Anybody can go and replicate our work. The one piece of data that you could say we create is we have a measure of the freedom to travel. Because a lot of short-term travel is actually for business, and you should be able to invite somebody. Stopping someone from coming and visiting you, being impingement upon your economic freedom. And so we measure the ability to get short-term visas, country to country. Okay? It's both objective and survey data. Ideally, we'd have hard data, right? Like government consumption as a percentage of total consumption. That's one of our variables. What does that mean? How many dollars are spent? What's your name, sir?
Michael.
Michael goes to Walmart and spends $10. That was Michael's decision to spend that. He got the goods and services. That's private consumption. Now, Medicaid spending. That's government consumption. Okay, we're at like, I can't remember, we're like something like 27% in the US. Wide range. There's countries in the world, both with high economic freedom and low economic freedom, that have 6%. So $6 every 100 are spent collectively. And we have countries as high as, I think we'll see later, 63. And we take all those data points and we organize them into 5 areas, and we put them on a 0 to 10 scale. And we set those high and low numbers by what existed in 1990. Okay, so if we think about government consumption as a percentage of total consumption, that was set at France, which was the highest at the time in 1990. And we do that because we want to know, we have to set something. Because if we want to know, is things getting better or worse over the time, we can't have the bar changing every year. And so higher ratings, you're going to see some examples of ratings later on. Higher ratings mean more economic freedom. So we break these down to 5 areas, and this is done for both pragmatic reasons, but also it's done to organize our thoughts into what we think are the 5 major areas, things that government both does in terms of access to sound money, but also areas that government intervenes. So we have size of government, that government consumption variable, taxation, marginal tax rates is a variable in there, the top marginal income tax rate. You might think that's double counting. The marginal income tax rate's not in there because we're worried about the revenue. Remember, in 1970, you had something like 17 countries with top marginal income tax rates in excess of 50%. And so the problem isn't necessarily the spending part of that, it's the deadweight loss, the economic activity that's not occurring, right, because of those high marginal income tax rates. States, we have a variable for state-owned enterprises. Obviously that hits countries like China pretty hard. Legal structure, security of property rights. This is the one that's all subjective data. It's all survey-based. Because how do we measure secure property rights? You could look at crime, but crime, there's a demand side of crime and there's a supply side of crime. So this is all survey-based. It asks people, how secure are you in your property? Again, comes from World Bank, the International Country Risk Guide. Access to sound money. We have low and stable rates of inflation. This is really big in the developing world, do you have the freedom to own private you have the freedom to hold currency of another country. If you're Zimbabwe and the inflation's at 10,000%, you might not want to hold Zimbabwean dollars. Well, what's the first thing the Zimbabwean central bank does? They make it illegal to hold other currencies, and you can go be imprisoned for doing so, right? At the very least, so many countries actually say you need central bank permission to hold foreign currency. Freedom to trade internationally, so we can think of things like tariffs, other barriers to trade, customs duties, and then finally regulation of credit, labor, and business. So I already talked a lot about Area 1, so I'm not going to focus on that. But let me give you an example of Area 5B. So Area 5B is the regulation of labor. And the reason I want to focus on 5B is I think it highlights something important. Like, all of these are named something. Remember, I'm talking about a representative individual in the country. And you might be saying, then why are you worried about the regulation of business? Well, I'm not so much worried about the regulation of business, but understand, regardless of your normative views about any one of these things, an hours regulation is an infringement both on the owners of the firm, right? So if you're in France and if you want to pay people to work 36 hours a week, you can't do so. But also, if you're an employee, you can't work 36 hours a week. I have a friend from Rockford, Illinois, who spent some time in France. His company sent him to France, and their parking lot's monitored. Their cars are monitored. They better not be in that lot for more than 32 hours a week. So each of these things is trying to capture different parts of that employment relationship. Military conscription, in some ways, the ultimate, that's conscription for military purpose, the ultimate kind of taking of labor market regulation, right? Centralized collective bargaining, so mandated collective bargaining usually at the country level. Hiring and firing regulations. Some countries, in order to fire somebody, even for poor performance, you have to pay up to a year's worth of wages. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So what are the top 10? Here's the top 10 plus the top 12 actually. I want to include the U.S. in there. So just to give you an idea, we have Hong Kong, Singapore. Hong Kong's been number 1 as long as we've measured. The U.S. was number 2 as late as 2000. The interesting thing is, you might ask, why have we fallen? We've fallen in all 5 of those areas. So we can't point at any particular thing. And it's not that other countries have gotten better. We've fallen by over half a point on this scale. Now, some of this make a lot of sense. We know what happened in 2001. We had 9/11. One of the areas we track is the time it takes for a package to clear customs. It takes 4 times longer for a package to clear customs today in the US than it did in 2000. Now, maybe that makes sense for other reasons unrelated to economic freedom, national security, but because we have a measurement, we know that's one of the now you might look at this and say, most of these countries have something in common. Island, small population, island, small population, island, small population, island, island, island. Okay, we have very few large heterogeneous population countries, so it says that there might be conditions under which economic freedom might be easier to get historically, if that's something you care about. I will point out, though, that there's lots of small homogeneous countries out there that are not on this list. So we can't just infer just from the top 10. We measure 159 countries in the world. So we have, I think, 96% of the world's population. There's still about 50 countries we don't measure. The last country that we do measure is Venezuela. As you can see, it's very much lower. We don't have data for Cuba. So our competitor index by the Heritage Foundation does rate Cuba. I don't know how they do that. We don't have very good data on Cuba, nor North Korea. Well, here's some other major population countries in the world. China. China would have been about Venezuela in 1980. So this is still very low in terms of the rating, right? It's still 112th, but that's a doubling of its score. And this raises a very important issue. Like anything with aggregate data you should be suspicious of, is in trying to get a picture with aggregate data, you're losing some of the heterogeneity that's underlying it. China's a very big country. There's 1 billion people. And there's vast differences between the eastern provinces and the western provinces. They have internal passports in China. If you want to move from a western province to go to an eastern province and work, you need central government permission, or you can't access any service. Your kids can't go to school. So they actually have a problem of, in the western provinces, of parents had to leave their kids and go to the east where the jobs are, and they have to leave their kids behind because they can't access schooling services in the east. So as good as things are, those western provinces might be even higher. They may not be like Italy. But, the eastern provinces might be like Italy. The western provinces are probably more like, maybe like Venezuela. For me, I'm in the section here, if you can follow along at the top, what have we learned? What have I learned? This to me is the biggest thing I've learned, is the anecdotes that when I was back in my political philosophy class and I used to argue about, when I can get the whole picture of 96, 97% of the world's population, that's not where the rubber meets the road. Right? USA's 11th, Denmark's 15th, Finland's 17th, Norway's 25th, even Sweden's 27th. People have private homes, yes, government taxes a lot higher and has much higher government consumption, but it's not China, it's not the Republic of the Congo. So it's not the size of government. So this is government consumption as a percentage of total consumption. And I should point out, let's go back here. Blue is the countries that are in the top quartile. So the top 25% of the country rate. Green, second quartile. Orange, third. And red, the bottom quartile. So if we think of government consumption as a percentage of total consumption, these are the bottom 10. We got blues, reds, oranges, and a green. We have a mixed bag. Government consumption, which is what a lot of people focus at as being big government. What's big government? It's not just how much it takes and spends, if that's something you care about, it's what it does with it. Sweden, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, they seem to do things that might be enhancing of markets. They provide private property rights, rule of law. Kuwait, okay, Saudi Arabia. In fact, this is we've added a new variable that's not in here. We were always concerned about those countries where we thought that it was not, the scores from these subjective indexes were not accurately representing the average person, who's probably a woman, in those countries. So a lot of, for example, Middle Eastern countries, some Asian countries, there's a really strong property rights protection, but women have no property rights protection. And the World Bank did a study on the extent to which women's property rights differ from men's. US, it doesn't under the law, maybe in practice. In many countries it does though, and we use that to adjust country scores. So it's not like how much government takes, it's what's done with it. This is Area 2C, protection of property rights. If government and us, because right, protection of property rights is both of those things. It's, I agree not to take your stuff, you agree not to take my stuff, right? If we all wanted to live in Hobbesian anarchy, I guess we'd be in Hobbesian anarchy. There's not enough police on the street. But that combination of morals and ethics and everything that individuals bring to the table combined with government focusing on those things. These countries have solved that problem, which has led to that doesn't exist in the countries that score very lowly on this measure and are all very prosperous, high-income countries. Right? If you told me, hey, I'm going to give you $100,000 and all you got to do is go live in one of the top 10 in the property rights protection, I'd go live in any one of those countries. If you said, I'm going to give you $250,000 and you have to go live for a year in any of the top 10 in government consumption, I know it's a much more risky proposition. I don't know if I'd do it. I'd be okay with getting some of the countries, but I'm not too sure. Now, it's easy to think like, oh, for $250,000, because you're thinking, I'm going to be the person with $250,000. But remember, some of these countries don't protect property very well. So these are just correlations. All of the graphs here, with the exception of one, will take the thing of, remember, red is least free quartile, blue is most free quartile. So if we look at just per capita incomes, these are adjusted for purchasing power across countries. The least free countries in the world that we measure, about $6,000 per person. Remember, China's in there. So China is the largest economy in the world now. Still, there's 1 billion people, so you divide that size of that economy across everybody else, it's still, I think, what, GDP per capita is about $5,000. Most free, $42,000. Here's the most troubling part for me. There's something in economics called convergence. And convergence is the idea that in terms of economic growth, it's this type of stuff that Tim works on entrepreneurship. It's innovation that leads to growth. But the great thing about innovation is once we invent something, we can just copy it at zero cost. The idea is the difficult thing, not the making of it. And so countries that are trying to catch up should grow faster. But what do we see? Like these are both underdeveloped countries or less developed countries, and they're also growing slower. Well, why? Well, one thing is they have those limits on economic freedom prevent those ideas and capital from coming in that will allow them to have the growth. It doesn't take a lot of economic freedom to actually get roughly comparable growth rates. And so if you care about the world's poor, this is, for me, the most troubling thing because they're not catching up. They're actually falling farther behind. Now, you might say, okay, go just correlations. This is a survey article that's in a peer journal called the Journal of Economic Surveys. And this is in light of that Samuelson graph where I think there was an open empirical question whether more economically free countries were going to grow faster. And he says, he summarizes in conclusion, most studies analyzing the relationship between economic growth and economic freedom have employed cross-country growth rates. We're looking at all these models. It's clear from these studies that EF seems to have a positive association with growth. None of the studies, so again, still not a sure thing, but none of the studies summarize reports that economic freedom is bad for growth. So what about the poor? The World Bank produces data on the income share that goes to the bottom 10%. So we take all the size of the pie in the country, the poorest 10%, how much do they get? Seems to be an iron law. Everybody gets about somewhere between 2.15 and 2.7. Not much difference. Right? But my co-author likes to point out, he's like, people don't eat out of income shares. They eat out of income. And if you look at the difference, how much income the bottom 10% has, I wouldn't, like we might be appalled, $11,000. This does not include in-kind transfers. This is just pure money income. $12,000 in the US and other most free countries. About $1,000, just over $1,000 in the least free countries. Poverty, these go the opposite way because this is the percentage living in extreme poverty, right? So here's extreme, and this is moderate. Extreme is what? $2 a day, no, $3.10 a day. Extreme is $1.90 a day. Moderate is $3.10 a day. Okay, you still have some extreme poverty, which is I think problematic, right, for the most free, but much higher rates of extreme and moderate poverty in the least free. Life expectancy. Now, I don't think people get more economic freedom, they just live longer, right? I'm sure the causality goes through income, because what do we do with higher incomes? We spend it on health. That's one of the things you spend it on. You take better care of yourself, right? I think of my grandmother, who swept up dust and dirt in a tobacco factory for 20 plus years, 6 days a week. And she made those sacrifices for her family, so her sons could be professionals and not have to do that. Right? I think their life expectancy hopefully is going to be a lot longer than hers. This is just an index of gender inequality. More economically free. One of the things we tend to, if you think purchase, is less gender inequality. Okay. Happiness. There's these surveys of happiness across countries. More free countries tend to be more happy. So there's several empirical studies. There's a huge literature. There's a Journal of Happiness Studies. This is a study on economic freedom. Findings indicate the existence of a causal channel from economic freedom to well-being. Well-being, they mean happiness. I don't know why they define. I think it's subjective well-being, because that's the questions asked. It's your subjective well-being. And a lot of people have pointed, if you know anything about locus of control, maybe it's that economic freedom means you just have greater authority over your, you can better achieve goals and actualize goals you set for yourself, and that's what makes people more happy. Okay, so some concerns you might have, I'm sure you're going to raise some others in the Q&A, is, and this is something that's always bothered me, what about bias? Right? Like, maybe I only read the good stuff, the stuff that comports to my priors. And I know other people are using this, so my co-author, Bob Wallace, and I did this thing in Contemporary Economic Policy, where we read every single article in this index called the Social Science Citation Index. This is a well-regarded index. It's a limited set. By limited, I mean it's like the top 214 journals. These are journals across economics, political science, business, forestry, you name it. We read all those papers. We created a huge spreadsheet that we then asked people to check, and we did different things. We said, how do they cite the paper? Did they say, China's become more economically free? See Economic Freedom Index. We call that a throwaway cite, right? It's just like, I gotta give something there. Did they actually use our data in a regression? And what were they looking at? What was the dependent variable? Were they trying to explain happiness or deforestation or anything? And then we asked, is it a core variable? And what we meant by core is, did they use the phrase economic freedom? Because you think people who call it economic freedom might have a different view than people who say, what's the relationship between neoliberalism and, or what's the relationship between institutions, or something else, some other phrase. Out of the 178 empirical papers, we coded 7 as normatively bad. Okay, now these are normative. We have to make a judgment call. What do we mean by a bad outcome? Okay, growth lowering. Right? deforestation increasing, air quality, right, getting poorer. That's a normatively bad outcome. The only thing that's really a judgment call, and I say this because I think the pattern, I think the question with income inequality is, why do we have income inequality? Do we have income inequality because certain segments of society have captured politicians and that money is not made? Like I personally am not, if income inequality is because somebody invents some great product and we all want to buy that product and that person has lots of money because we have this product, everybody, like, I don't have a problem with that, but I have a problem with it if you know, somebody's fabulously wealthy because they're well connected in Washington, D.C., and are able to funnel business to themselves, or greatly restrict their industry such that they get higher income. So we label income inequality as normatively bad. And so of these bad articles, 3 of them indicate that more economic freedom does lead to greater income inequality. At the same time, there's 3 other papers that show more economic freedom, it leads to greater income equality. So I think more research needs to be done on that particular issue. It does seem to suggest there's some sort of trade-off. And I will point out, this is cross-country. We have vast differences in economic freedom. Across states, or there's a thing of Indian states, Canadian states, Mexican states, we tend to see less extreme results. What I take away from this is you have a large number of people with very diverse priors. I mean, one of the things that made me feel good in reading these papers is papers saying, and as somebody who's an empirical economist who changes my mind on things all the time when the data show me otherwise, is you're reading papers and people are saying, contrary to our expectation, economic freedom was positively related to environmental quality. Right? They had some other prior that it was negatively related to. I think there's still a lot more stuff that needs to be researched, especially within country. We also don't know a lot about why do we get countries falling behind in economic freedom? Why do we get countries jumping ahead in economic freedom? But I think that could be something we can speculate on in the Q&A. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Right there, yeah.
How is cost of living factored into economic freedom?